Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. So this is going to be kind of like an intro video to a mini series of a series of videos focusing mainly on the finishing process. Now we figured, why don't we make this kind of like a miniature course? You can follow along with this if you're just beginning, and all of these steps will apply regardless of what you're doing. If you're casting 3D prints, if you're fabricating jewelry, whatever, it's all going to apply in some way, shape, or form. And we'll explain all of that as we go. We decided that every step deserved its own video because there's so many things we can talk about at every step. It's just worth the detail. So if you want to follow along with this video, we are going to be doing fabrication of a basic copper ring, just a flat style ring with nothing too fancy. But we figured that this would be nice as a way to walk through step by step. For example, showing you the difference between files, what sanding lines look like, making sure that you do the sanding steps properly, and then obviously the final polish and what that should look like. And being able to follow this step by step makes things a little bit easier. So if you want to follow along with this step by step, please do. Let's get into it. So you can buy copper plate between I think 22 gauge and 16 gauge from Guesswin for I think $60 a sheet, 12 inches by 12 inches. This is what I have left of my 12-inch sheet. From that, you can use it for all sorts of things. You can use build like to exercises. This was used for riveting, a little bit of texture, whatever. So I've cut this little piece of copper as a rectangle. From here, we need to decide how big it needs to be, or how long rather. Determining how big of a piece of copper you'll need to make this ring, you need to determine your ring size. Basically just pick a finger and you can follow this formula. It is essentially the diameter of the ring plus the thickness of the material twice times pi. Then you need to determine the width of your ring. You can make it very thin or very thick, whatever is easiest for you. In this case, I've made it 1/2 inch or about 12 millimeters. And I'm going to score this line. And that is essentially our ring blank. Now, if you can cut, how you cut this is up to you. If you're just starting, maybe you have something like a jeweler's saw and you want to start cutting this way. If you have access to a bench shear and you can just zip that right off, easy peasy. So now that we have our blank, we can start to form this into a ring. For this process, I'm going to be using some ring bending pliers. These have a half round side and a flat side. And essentially what they do is help me get some leverage and start to bend the ring into shape. Now I'm just going to kind of walk the pliers down and do little bends. My goal is actually not to create a perfect circle with this process. All I want to do is make it so that this end and this end meet. You'll also notice that I was off on a little bit of an angle there. Very simple to fix. Just go like this and make everything square again. So you'll see here that if your ring was not bent squarely, they won't meet up, but it's not that big a deal. We'll just go back, grab this, and what I'm going to actually pay attention to the most is making sure that these sides are parallel and that gap in between is parallel as well. That means everything's nice and square. You'll also notice that this right here and right here, there's a little bit of a lip right on this side. That I did intentionally because I wanted to show you how to fix that later on. It's only off by 0.2 millimeters, but if you end up with a piece that kind of flares, maybe that's part of your design, but if it's not intended, then it'll have to be fixed. So even though the ring is not pretty by any means yet, it is not round by any standard, we're going to continue with this because we want at this point to get this joint together by any means possible. We have the ring mandrel afterwards to make sure that this can go round again, but making this seem tight and ready for soldering is of the most importance right now. So what I'm going to do, my little trick, is I overbend just a little bit like this, and I pull it back, and I listen for that click. Push it the other way, and when I come back, they should have a little bit of tension in between, and they'll be forcing themselves together. You'll see it's not quite perfect, but that's fine. Again, we'll just muscle that into place, just like that. So that is a pretty good seam. This is called a butt joint, where you're basically just taking two flat ends and putting them together, filling that with solder. There are other ones called lap joints, where you filed in angles and you make them meet. And there's others where you kind of cut tabs and you make like a locking system. But we're not going to get into that. We're just going to do the basics today, where we just do the butt joint and making sure that that's all nice and together. When you run your finger over that, you shouldn't notice, maybe you'll feel like a little bit of a dip, but you shouldn't feel anything that you can catch on either way, okay? The better you can get at doing this, the faster you'll make rings, that's for sure. So now that we have this is ready for soldering. Let's go over and do that quickly. You can do this with a little butane torch, or in my case, I have an oxypropane torch set up, and it's all gonna do the same job. So there's a few things that we need to talk about regarding soldering before we actually solder the ring. For starters, solder comes in different grades. There's easy, medium, and hard. And it's generally available in two different forms. There's these sheets, very, very thin sheets that are labeled at the bottom. They come in easy, medium, and hard. And I like to use a special set of shears, or even just a regular pair of scissors works, where you notch them and then you cut them into these tiny little pieces. And you ball them up with your torch. With a soldering pick, you can then pick them up and put them where you want them. This is very nice for doing filigree work, and generally speaking, this is what you'd want to be doing for this process. They also make solder in wire form, and wire is good for basically welding. You're doing a long seam, much longer than a ring generally, and you want to just keep feeding this wire in and filling your space. This is nice because you can just work continuously. You also need a flux. Flux is, honestly, I'm not really sure what it is, but basically this stuff helps keep the metal clean. If you've ever worked with or heated up copper and you've seen like that black tarnish that goes all over it, as soon as your metal becomes tarnished, it no longer will solder. You can't solder an oxided metal to itself. It just doesn't like it. Flux will prevent that from happening in the area where you put it. So in this case, if you wanted to dip the whole piece in the flux, that works. Or you can use a brush and just paint it onto the area. You want to make sure that it's very thorough, painting it front and back, making sure it penetrates that gap. That's the best way to go about it. Some other things that you should have, this is called a third hand. It's just a pair of tweezers that you can use for holding things. Obviously, when you're working hot, you can't hold it with your own hands, so having something like this really helps if the ring doesn't, like to sit on its own. I have a whole pile of these, and they're very, very useful. The other thing to have is a good pair of tweezers. I actually have a whole pile of tweezers. They're all really good to have. They will break down with use. When you work hot, the little ends tend to get all messed up, so it's good to have backups and stuff for later on. The torch I'll be using is called the Smith Little Torch. These little nibs, or these tips, are all interchangeable. I believe I'm using the size 6, which is actually the second largest one. But they also go down as low as a number 1, which is a very, very small micro flame, which is still the full amount of heat coming out the end, but the tip, or the flame, is only about that big, and it's very good for doing like tiny, like watch part soldering. In this case, you can use any size tip you like. So when it comes to lighting a torch, you have to follow a very specific sequence. You always light the fuel. In this case, I'm working with propane, and it always is lined up with the red dial. Usually it's on the left. You always light your fuel first. In this case, I'm just going to crack this just a little bit. This is a sparker. I'm just going to light it so that I get a little bit of a flame. If it's too big, and you get this gap in between on your torch, as soon as you add the oxygen, it'll just blow it right up. And if that happens, you have to start the whole process over again. So we're just going to crack, light, dial this up a little bit, making sure that there is no gap between the flame and your torch tip, and then add oxygen. There are different kinds of flame. So this is called a reducing flame, where it's a bit more bushy, and you can see how it's got that little tail of orange left in it. This is good for just generally large heating of a surface. And if you add more oxygen, you get what's called an oxidizing flame, and you get a very, very sharp, bright cone coming out of the tip. Now, because this is propane, I'm not too worried about it. It doesn't put off any UV light. However, if you use acetylene, you should be wearing eye protection of some kind, because that brightness, that cone, is very, very bad for your eyes. It throws off UV. In a jewelry-sized torch, it's only a jewelry-size amount. If you use a big torch, like a melting torch, you definitely should have eye protection. Anyway, so treating this with respect, now that we have this lit, I'm going to go over to our piece. You're going to flux your piece. Make sure it's well fluxed. Something to note across pretty much all metals is you need to have the entire ring heated up, not just the area you're working, or it won't flow. When you're soldering, you use the word flow, not melt. Because if you melted it, you probably melted the entire thing, not just what you're working on. The word melt when in soldering to jewelers is a very bad word. So something I'm going to do that you should not do, that you'll learn not to do in the future videos, I am going to add too much solder to this joint. Because later on when I do the filing, this is going to help us visually learn what not to do and how to fix it. So anyway, we're going to heat up the ring. I'm going to just apply the wire until I make a little ball. Then I'm going to go to the other side because this is such a wide ring, and apply another ball. Now at this stage, if it's not going fast enough for you, you can always adjust your flame. You'll notice that I like to work all the way around the piece, because as I said before, you have to have the entire piece heated up for it to flow. And you'll see as soon as it gets to the right temperature, the solder flows very easily and becomes like a silver puddle. Now there's a little trick. I'll dial my torch down and I'll get inside the ring, because what solder does is it follows the heat. So if the flame is on the inside, it will pull the solder down through the seam if it didn't do it already. So this is a very, very over soldered seam. For doing a seam this size, all you really need is a very small piece. Just a tiny little chip of solder is all you really need for doing something this size. But like I said, we added too much solder so that later on I can fix this and show you how to do that. So the next thing you're going to need to do is called pickling. I know that sounds funny, but it's called a pickle pot. Basically, we take our hot, very oxidized ring. As you can see, it's all different colors, which is kind of pretty, but ultimately not what we're aiming for. This all has to come off. And the easiest way to do that is chemically. So we drop it into the pickle pot, which is full of this stuff, Sparex. There's actually alternatives that you can use for pickle. I've heard salt and hot vinegar works. I've heard that pH down, which is a chemical you add for pools, works. This is essentially the same thing. I haven't experimented too much with it because I just know that this stuff works. Anyway, So SpareX only works when it's really hot. This is generally the rule for all pickle. What it's doing is essentially just attacking the oxides of the metal. It's not removing anything from this process at all. Something to note about SpareX and generally pH down in general is you have to use copper tools when working with it, copper or plastic, because if I was to reach into the pickle with a set of steel, it would contaminate this pickle. It would dissolve a little bit of the iron. And then what it would do is actually plate silver with that iron and turn the silver pink. And then to get rid of that, you have to do a lot of heavy sanding, and it's just a big pain in the butt. On a different note, though, if you're working mostly with copper, you can intentionally contaminate your pickle. Then use silver solder, which normally would appear as a silver line on your piece, just like this. And it will plate only the silver solder with that iron, making it pink, making it blend into the copper a little bit better. So once the piece has been sitting in the pickle for a few minutes, you can reach in with your copper tongs, pull it out, and just give it a quick rinse. You'll notice that the color change has, a lot of that black oxide has come off, and if you just wipe it lightly, it will just slough right off of the metal and leave it nice and clean. So this is what you're looking for right here. Very little oxide still on the surface. You can always put it back in the pickle and let it keep working. It will reach a point where it's just absolutely clean and it won't do any more. So from here, now that we have a ring that has been closed, we can now go take this and turn it into a proper circle on the ring mandrel with a hammer. So let's go do that. Okay, so now that we have the ring soldered, we're ready to make it into a ring, an actual ring. Now what you need for this is called a ring mandrel, and they come in various sizes and shapes. This one is called a bezel mandrel. It's essentially just a slimmed down version of this. This one doesn't have any markings on it, as you'll notice on this one. This is all official US ring sizes and half and quarter sizes as well. And then there's also ones for different shapes. This is obviously a square. This one's fairly rare, actually. I don't see too many big square ones around anymore, but anyway. But this is by far the most common and the one you'll need for doing the majority of your work. Now, as you can see, my ring is pretty big. This is a size 13. And now I'm going to be using a plastic hammer, something like this with a plastic end. And the reason I'm going to be using something like this versus something like this, which is called a planishing hammer with steel, with a steel head, is as soon as you hit this and you're sandwiching this very soft copper metal in between two steel surfaces, what happens is you get that forged texture. And essentially what that's doing is stretching the metal. And that means that it's going to be making it bigger and bigger and bigger, and we don't want that. We just want it to be nice and round. So plastic, not being harder than the copper, is just going to push the metal where we want it to go. So you can see what I'm doing. I'm just working on the edge, on the back half, because this is a cone shape, if I work on the front, what it's going to do is create a cone-shaped ring, and we don't want that. We want a nice round ring. So we're going to work on one side first. Then we'll flip the whole thing over and work on this side. And what that's going to do is keep the sides of the ring nice and parallel. So there we have a much better ring shape. From here on, now we can go into the filing step, where we clean up the sides and the top and the inside and start to make this into something more pretty. All right, so if you've been following along so far, now you have a nice copper ring blank. From here, the real work begins, and we start to make this into more of a finished product. We're going to start with filing, then sanding, and finally polishing. I think that every step deserves the attention of its own video because I can go into such detail about every little aspect, different tools and methods and things like that. So if you're very familiar with any one of these steps, feel free to skip it, move on to the one that you're more interested in. And we'll also timestamp it so that you can follow along more specifically with what you want to see. So that's all for this video. Thank you very much for watching. You can basically treat this video series like a miniature course if you're just starting your jewelry process. I look forward to seeing and hearing from you in the comments. Please like and so if you like this content, please like and subscribe. We have a membership program below. Feel free to check out those tiers. We'd love to hear from you. We'll see you guys in the next video.